French designer and business entrepreneur Coco Chanel revolutionized fashion, came up with one of history's most popular perfumes, and was an inspiration to millions around the world. Less known is that she was also a rabid anti-Semite who collaborated with the Nazis when the Germans conquered France in World War II. Below are 30 things about that and other lesser-known historic facts about businesses and business people. The 20th century's most influential fashion designer. French fashion designer and businesswoman Gabrielle Bonheur Coco Chanel dominated Paris' haute couture scene for 6 decades. She came up with elegant casual designs that killed off uncomfortable 19th fashions such as petticoats and corsets. Her innovations include the little black dress, costume jewelry, the Chanel suit, and quilted purses. The most famous item associated with her name, however, is the first perfume she launched, Chanel No. 5. When Time magazine published its list of 100 most influential people of the 20th century, Coco Chanel was the only fashion designer who made the cut. Gabrielle claimed that Coco was a nickname given her by her father, but that is probably one of many untruths she made up about her family background. She reportedly got the name in her years as a cabaret singer, when she often performed a then popular song called Who Has Seen Coco? Other accounts have it that it was a play on cocotte, the French term for a mistress. Yet another version has it that she was called Coco because she threw the most fabulous cocaine parties in Paris. However she acquired the name, she revolutionized the fashion business as Coco Chanel, and inspired millions. Less known about her is she was a rabid anti-Semite, an admirer of Hitler, and a Nazi collaborator who worked as a spy for the Germans in World War II. During the German occupation of France, Coco Chanel asked the Nazis to confiscate her Jewish partner's share of the business, and hand it over to her. Coco Chanel had long been a reactionary and anti-Semite, and got on well with others who disliked Jews. In 1923 she began a 10-year affair with Hugh Richard Arthur Grosvenor, 2nd Duke of Westminster, one of the world's richest men at the time, and a rabid anti-Semite. In the 1930s, she began a relationship with an illustrator named Paul Iribe, and financed his monthly journal, a reactionary, anti-Republican and anti-Semitic rag. She often stated that she believed that the Jews were a threat to Europe. As such, it is no surprise that Chanel got on well with the Nazis, and collaborated with them when they conquered France in 1940. In the years of occupation, Chanel lived in Paris' Hotel Ritz, where many high-ranking German military and Nazi officials dwelt. She also became the mistress of a Baron Gunther von Dinklage, a diplomat and German military intelligence operative. Before the war, the majority owner of Perfumes Chanel, the company that marketed Chanel No. 5, was a Jewish businessman named Pierre Wertheimer. The Nazis routinely confiscated Jewish property and gave it to Aryans. Chanel petitioned the Nazis that since she was Aryan, they ought to seize the Jewish Wertheimer share of Perfumes Chanel, and hand it over to her. Unbeknownst to her, however, Wertheimer had guessed that the Nazis would confiscate Jewish properties, so before they got around to it, he transferred legal ownership of his business entities to a French Christian industrialist. He had more integrity than Chanel, and returned them to Wertheimer after the war. A Nazi collaborator who got off light. After the war, French intelligence described Chanel as a Hitler fan and vicious anti-Semite. She was more than that. She was a collaborator and traitor who had directly worked for France's Nazi occupiers. Declassified documents released decades after her death confirmed that Chanel had worked for both the Abwehr, German military intelligence, and the dreaded Sicherheitsdienst SD, the intelligence arm of the SS and Nazi Party. Her SD boss was SS General Walter Schellenberg, who was sentenced by the Nuremberg Tribunal to 6 years for war crimes. After his release in 1951, Chanel supported him and his family financially, and paid for his funeral when he died a year later. When Paris was liberated in 1944, Chanel fled to Switzerland to avoid criminal charges for collaboration with the Germans as a spy. She lived there with her German lover Baron Dinklage, before she returned to France in the 1950s, to get back in the fashion business. Ironically, her comeback was financed by Pierre Wertheimer, the Jewish entrepreneur she had tried to screw out of the Perfumes Chanel business during the war. Whatever he thought about her as a person, he was the majority owner of a lucrative enterprise and brand, and that bore her name. As such, he had a financial stake in the preservation of her image. Her comeback was a success, and the public by and large remained ignorant what kind of person Coco Chanel really was until long after her death in 1971, at age 87. In hindsight, New Year's 1962 was not a happy one for this business executive. In the 1950s and 1960s, few men wielded more influence in Britain's music industry than did Richard Dick Rowe, the head of Decca Records, Artists and Repertoire. Rowe was the man in charge of finding new artists who showed promise. Although he became famous or infamous for an epically bad business decision, Rowe was overall pretty good at what he did. Among other artists, he signed the Rolling Stones, Tom Jones, Cat Stevens, The Animals, and then the band that launched Van Morrison. Unfortunately, his reputation and name would be forever tied with the one group he failed to sign. It began on New Year's Day 1962, when Brian Epstein, the manager of an unheralded musical group, took his young talents to audition with Decca Records at their studios in West Hampstead, North London. They were there at the invitation of one of Rowe's under-subordinates, Mike Smith, who had heard the band play a few weeks earlier. He liked what he heard enough to ask them to do a session at Decca's studio. The group drove to London all the way from Liverpool, in the middle of a snowstorm, and made it just on time for their 11 a.m. audition. Guitar groups are on the way out. After their long drive through a snowstorm just to reach Decca Records on time, the members of Brian Epstein's group were understandably annoyed when the man who had invited them, Mike Smith, showed up late. Smith, who had apparently partied hard the night before, unnerved the young musicians, even more when he refused to let the group use their own amplifiers. Instead, he demanded that they use Decca's amplifiers, which he deemed to be superior to ones used by Epstein's charges. After they set up, tuned and strung their guitars and cleared their throats, the group performed about 15 songs before Smith and his boss Dick Rowe. The group was nervous, what with the drive through a snowstorm, the late arrival of their host, and the use of different amplifiers, so they were not at their best. Nonetheless, they felt confident that had done well enough to secure a contract. After the audition, however, Rowe decided to pass on the group, and declined to sign them, with the airy remark that guitar groups are on the way out, Mr. Epstein. As seen below, that might have been the worst decisions in the music business. The man who passed on the 1960s greatest band. Epstein and his group left Decca Studios dejected that their new year had began with a rejection. Not so Dick Rowe, who figured that 1962 had started auspiciously for him and his label. That same day, he had listened to another band that came in for an audition, liked what he heard, and signed up Brian Poole and the Tremolos to a deal with Decca Records. As Rowe recalled later, he had told his A&R subordinate Mike Smith to decide between Epstein's group and Brian Poole and the Tremolos. He said, "They're both good, but one's a local group, the other comes from Liverpool. We decided it was better to take the local group. We could work with them more easily and stay closer in touch as they came from Dagenham. So they went with the Tremolos. All in all, that was not a bad business decision in of itself, as the band had some success in the United Kingdom. In 1963, they entered the UK charts with a cover of the Isley Brothers' Twist and Shout, and followed it up with a UK chart-topping cover of the Contours' Do You Love Me? A year later, they did a cover of Roy Orbison's Candyman that pleased the Brits, and a cover of the Crickets' Someone Someone, which made it to number 2 on the UK charts. Rowe's bad decision was his rejection of, and failure to sign the other band that had auditioned the same day as the Tremolos, the Silver Beatles, who soon shortened their name to the Beatles. Failure to sign the Beatles was Dick Rowe's worst business decision, but not the only bad one. The rejection of the Beatles in favor of Brian Poole and the Tremolos made Dick Rowe and Decca Records synonymous with bad business moves and catastrophic commercial misjudgments. Incredibly, Rowe's decision to pass on the biggest band of all time which was bad enough in of itself to enshrine his name in the Bad Business Decisions Hall of Fame, was not his sole episode of monumental short-sightedness. Just 5 years after he failed to sign the Beatles, Rowe turned down another musical icon. In late 1966, Jimi Hendrix arrived in London and instantly created a stir at his debut in the British capital before an audience whose numbers included Eric Clapton. Hendrix's guitar play blew all and sundry away. A bassist and drummer were quickly rounded up to form the Jimi Hendrix Experience, and they recorded their first single, Hey Joe. Then their manager Michael Jeffrey approached Dick Rowe to try and get a record deal, only for Decca Records' A&R man to pass. So Hendrix ended up at the recently launched Track Records instead. The man who made Coca-Cola, and the man who made Coca-Cola a giant. Coca-Cola was invented in the late 19th century by John Stith Pemberton, a Civil War Confederate colonel and morphine addict with a medical degree. he sought to develop a non-addictive drink, and eventually came up with and registered Pemberton's French wine Coca Nerve Tonic. Inspired by Vin Mariani, a 19th-century coca wine medicine, it was basically Coca-Cola with alcohol. When Atlanta prohibited the sale of booze, he marketed a non-alcoholic version, Coca-Cola, the temperance drink. It appealed widely to opponents of alcohol. In 1888, a young druggist named Asa Candler bought a one-third interest in the formula for $50 down and $500 in 30 days. When Pemberton died a few months later, Candler swiftly secured the exclusive right to the Coca-Cola name. He was better at business than Pemberton and saw the concoction's potential. So he set up a corporation and began to widely market the drink. By the early 20th century, the Coca-Cola Company was America's and the world's biggest soft drink manufacturer and seller. Coke could have bought Pepsi multiple times, but declined. While Coca-Cola zoomed to the stratosphere, another soft drink concocted in the same era, Pepsi, languished. Pepsi was created in 1893, and for decades, it was a niche drink with a tiny market, and was nowhere near Coca-Cola's league. In short, it posed no challenge to the soft drink giant's dominance. That began to change in the 1920s. Charles Guth, president of candy manufacturer Loft Incorporated, asked Coca-Cola for a discount on its syrup, which was used in some of his retail stores' soda fountains. Coca-Cola refused to give him what he wanted, so he cast around for alternatives. Pepsi did not have as savvy a business visionary at its head as Coke's Asa Candler, and in 1923 it went into bankruptcy. Guth swooped in and bought it for $10,500, roughly $185,000 today, and had chemists rework its formula to come as close to Coke as possible. Over the following decade, Pepsi-Cola was offered to the Coca-Cola Company for purchase on various occasions, but the soda giant declined the offer each time. Coca-Cola's failure to buy Pepsi when it could have turned out to be a bad business decision. In hindsight, Coca-Cola's refusal to buy Pepsi more than once turned out to be a bad business decision that the company came to regret. Charles Guth turned Pepsi around within just 2 years after he had bought it, and transformed it into a profitable enterprise. By 1936, Pepsi sold about 500 million bottles a year, and established itself as the second largest soda company, behind only Coca-Cola. It was right around then that Loft Incorporated accused Guth of breach of fiduciary duty, and sued him. The Delaware Supreme Court eventually agreed with Loft, and established what came to be known as the Guth Rule in American corporate law. The rule prohibits corporate representatives from taking personal advantage of business opportunities that could have been exploited by their employer. Loft seized Pepsi from Guth in 1939, concentrated on the drink, and spun off the non-soda businesses in 1941. The Pepsi brand continued to grow, and eventually merged with Frito-Lay in 1965 to become PepsiCo. That new company went on to finally eclipse Coke in sales in the 1980s, and in 2005, PepsiCo surpassed the Coca-Cola Company in market value. History's first airline to earn revenue from the transportation of passengers via aircraft. In 1908, German Count Ferdinand von Zeppelin founded Luftschiffbau Zeppelin, a company that designed and manufactured rigid lighter-than-air vessels or airships. In World War I, Zeppelin airships were employed as history's first long-range strategic bombers, and carried out numerous raids against France, Belgium, and Britain. Although the damage they inflicted was relatively minor, the giant cigar-shaped Zeppelins became objects of terror to civilians below. The sight of the rigid airships over London in particular, and the efforts to bring them down, became iconic in the war years. The Count's airships had civilian applications as well. In 1909, the German Airship Transport Company, which went by its German acronym DELAG, was founded as a commercial offshoot of Luftschiffbau Zeppelin to transport passengers. Headquartered in Frankfurt, Germany, it became history's first airline to earn revenue from the transport of people via aircraft. Between 1910 and the outbreak of World War I, DELAG carried over 30,000 passengers in more than 1,500 flights. Then the war came and hit it hard. First, the German government requisitioned its airships for military use. Then when Germany lost the war, the Treaty of Versailles awarded the company's best Zeppelins to the victors. DELAG bounced back, however. A business upturn that ended in sudden catastrophe. DELAG overcame its wartime and post-war setbacks, and went back to business. By 1928 it had designed and built airships capable of non-stop transatlantic flights, years before passenger airplanes had the range to do the same. By the mid-1930s, DELAG had flown commercial passengers for 3 decades. Its Zeppelins had carried tens of thousands of paying passengers over 1 million miles, in more than 2,000 flights, without a single injury. As their rigid airships' popularity soared ever higher, it was widely assumed that they were the wave of the future. Things looked rosy for the company, but there was an overlooked problem. DELAG's latest milestone by the mid-1930s was posh giant airships. They flew passengers across the Atlantic in luxury and style, in a mere 60 hours, remarkable for commercial travel back then. Many predicted that airships would dominate global travel. Then catastrophe struck. The Hindenburg, DELAG's flagship and the biggest airship ever built, twice as high and 3 times as long as a Boeing 747 jumbo jet. On May 6, 1937, after an uneventful transatlantic flight, the Hindenburg tried to dock with a mooring mast in Lakehurst, New Jersey. Out of the blue it suddenly erupted in flames. A disastrous decision to fill its airships with hydrogen doomed DELAG. It took only 37 seconds from when the first spark appeared on the Hindenburg for the world's biggest airship to get destroyed by fire. Of 97 people on board, 35 perished and another person died on the ground. The spectacular disaster, captured on film and widely disseminated around the world, shattered public confidence in that mode of transport. It brought the airship era to an abrupt end, and killed off DELAG's fortunes along with it. At the time, the catastrophe was commonly blamed on sabotage. The Hindenburg was not only the pride of DELAG, but also a source of German national pride, and a symbol of resurgence under the Nazis. Many were eager to stick it to the Nazis. Threatening letters had been received, and a fired bullet was advanced as a plausible cause for the fire's start. Another widely accepted hypothesis pinned the blame on a static spark. Whether an accidental spark or a deliberate shot, the catastrophe would not have happened, if not for DELAG's disastrous business decision to fill its airships with highly flammable hydrogen, instead of a less combustible alternative such as helium. If the Hindenburg had used helium, as airships do today, then neither a spark nor a shot could have reduced it to an inferno in less than a minute. The founder of America's top-seller whiskey brand, Jasper Newton Jack Daniel, was a distiller and business entrepreneur, who is best known as the founder of the Jack Daniel's Whiskey Distillery in Tennessee. It created the Jack Daniel's whiskey brand, a bourbon or whiskey, which eventually became the most widely sold American whiskey in the U.S. and the world. It holds that top rank to this day. In 2017, the most recent year for which information is publicly available, 16.1 million cases of Jack Daniel's brands were sold worldwide. Jack Daniel, who was born in Lynchburg, Tennessee, went to work as a child for a preacher, who also made money as a grocer and moonshine distiller. The boy did not exhibit much enthusiasm for grocery or the gospel, but when his boss showed him how to operate his whiskey still, or ordered a slave to show him, young Daniel took to it like a fish to water. He exhibited a precocious talent that led him to get his own distillery license, reportedly while he was still a teenager. A business entrepreneur killed by his own safe. Jack Daniel's whiskey became popular, and in 1897 the brand gained its distinctive appearance, when Jack began to use square-shaped bottles. The reputation of Jack Daniel's was greatly enhanced after it won the gold medal for finest whiskey at the 1904 St. Louis World Fair. That led to a surge of popularity nationwide, even as Daniel's reputation suffered locally as a result of the growth of the temperance movement that eventually brought about prohibition. Jack did not live to see that dark day for his business. He was killed years before its arrival by his office safe. Jack often forgot the combination to his safe, and usually relied on a trusted office assistant to open it for him. One day in October 1911, he went to work early, and arrived at the office before his assistant. He tried to open the safe but was unable to do so on his own. Frustrated, he kicked the safe and injured his toe in the process. The toe became infected, the infection spread, and on October 10, 1911, Jack Daniel died of blood poisoning. The safe went on to gain legendary status as featured prominently in tours of the facilities, and even got sent out on public tours of its own. Long before the Colombian cartels, Britain dominated the drug business. The United States invaded Panama in the 20th century because it was unhappy with Panamanian government actions that furthered and facilitated the drug trade. In the 19th century, Britain invaded China because it was displeased with the Chinese government's actions against the drug trade. Back then, Victorian Britain was the world's biggest drug trafficker, bigger than any Latin American drug cartel or any combination of such cartels. And unlike today's narco-traffickers, Britain did not conduct its narcotics business in the shadows of the global criminal underground, but instead did so openly and in the full light of day. So openly that Britain fought wars in order to force a foreign government to allow British merchants whose business revolved around the sale of drugs to sell narcotics by the thousands of tons in its territory. The war's roots traced back to the mid-18th century, when the British East India Company began to grow opium, from which heroin is refined. The crop was shipped to China for a hefty profit. Opium was illegal in China, but the British got around that through loopholes or simply smuggled it in. When China seized and destroyed stocks of illegal opium in its territory, Britain demanded compensation. Chinese opium consumption skyrocketed and British profits from the opium trade went through the roof. In the meantime, China faced an addiction epidemic that caused widespread social and economic disruptions. The Chinese authorities finally began to take serious measures to stop the British from flooding their country with opium. In 1839, a drug czar was appointed, and he initiated a crackdown. 1,700 drug dealers were arrested, and over 1,400 tons of opium that sat in warehouses were seized and destroyed. Most of that opium belonged to British merchants, and they appealed to their government. Pressured by its business lobby, Britain demanded compensation from the Chinese government. To back those demands, it sent a military expedition to China. It arrived in June of 1840 and sailed up the Pearl River estuary to Canton. After months of negotiations that went nowhere, the British attacked and seized Canton in May of 1841. The Chinese armies still used medieval weapons and tactics. They were thoroughly outmatched by the British forces, armed with the latest firearms and artillery, and drilled in the most advanced tactics. Britain fought a second opium war to force China to accept the sale and distribution of drugs in its territory. The British invaders easily beat back a Chinese attempt to retake Canton, then seized the city of Nanking in August of 1842. The Chinese sued for peace, and negotiations concluded in the Treaty of Nanking. The Chinese had to agree to pay a huge indemnity and cede Hong Kong to the British. The number of treaty ports where the British could trade and reside was also increased from 1 to 5. On top of that, British citizens were also granted extraterritoriality, or the right to be tried by British courts, instead of Chinese ones, for offenses committed in China. The conflict came to be known as the First Opium War, as its numerical designation indicates. It was not the only time that Britain warred with China over Chinese attempts to halt the sale and distribution of opium within their borders. A second opium war was waged, also caused by Chinese resistance to the British opium that flooded their country. This time around, Britain sought to force China to completely legalize the opium trade, exempt foreign imports from internal Chinese tariffs, and allow British business entrepreneurs access to all of China. In the name of opium and expanded business opportunities, an Anglo-French army marched on Beijing. France, which also sought greater trade concessions and business opportunities from China, eagerly joined Britain in the Second Opium War. The disparity between the Chinese and Western forces was even greater this second time around. Moreover, the Chinese were in the midst of a huge peasant revolt, the Taiping Rebellion, whose leader claimed to be Jesus Christ's younger brother. The combined British and French army had little trouble in seizing Canton in 1857, and as China's military setbacks mounted, the Chinese government sued for peace. When talks broke down, the invaders sailed to northern China, seized the Taku forts near Tianjin, and advanced upon Beijing. That brought the Chinese back to the negotiating table. At some point in the midst of the fresh round of diplomacy, a British envoy insulted his Chinese counterpart, and was arrested along with his party. Half of his entourage were tortured to death. In retaliation, the Anglo-French forces attacked and routed a Chinese army near Beijing, and forced the emperor to flee his capital. In the name of business and the right to sell drugs, an Anglo-French army committed a great act of cultural vandalism. After its victory outside Beijing, the Anglo-French army seized a vast imperial compound known as the Summer Palace. There, the soldiers plundered anything made of gold or silver, then indulged themselves in an orgy of destruction for the sheer fun of it. They crushed exquisite statues, smashed pricey objects of porcelain and jade, ripped precious paintings with their bayonets, and paraded in expensive and ornate silk robes, from the imperial wardrobe for comic effect. Then they put the entire palace complex to the torch. The destruction of the Summer Palace was one of the greatest acts of cultural vandalism of the past few centuries. As one British officer described it, when we first entered the gardens they reminded one of those magic grounds described in fairy tales. We marched from them upon the 19th October, leaving them a dreary waste of ruined nothings. Utterly defeated, the Chinese capitulated and signed a peace treaty in 1860 that granted all the invaders' demands for business concessions. Said demands included the complete legalization of the opium trade within China's borders,